Our guest this evening is no stranger to facing these sorts of challenges. Some of you will remember him from one of our prior events in Napa, California. He was the largest foreign investor in Russia up until 2005. He's an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin, and he's dedicated his life to exposing corruption in Russia. He's the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. He's the head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, and he is the author of two phenomenal books, Red Notice and Freezing Order. Please welcome my friend Bill Browder.
Good evening. So Kevin invited me to Napa Valley in July of 2017 to speak to you, and I think there are some veterans of that speech. And it was really, it was a wonderful event and a wonderful venue, and there was only one problem, which was that I wasn't sure what to wear because it was really, really hot in Napa. And so I normally would wear a jacket, whatever, but I shed my jacket, left it in the room, and just went out there. And then what happens is, we were in this beautiful setting, sort of overlooking the vineyard, and it was like my moment to speak was just as the sun had set, and it started freezing. And I was just wearing my shirt, and I had been a little sweaty, and I was freezing. And so I'm delighted to say that when coming here, I was freezing from the get-go. I'm really happy to be back, and Kevin, thank you for being a friend and ally. So as Kevin mentioned, there's two books that I've written. My first one was Red Notice. And I wrote Red Notice, I should say that I had never intended to write any book. I was a hedge fund manager in Russia. I never, in college, wanted to be an author. I never had written anything longer than a 4-page monthly investment summary. But I had a really important story to tell, which was the story of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, how he was murdered. I was talking about the Magnitsky Act, which was some justice for him. And it was sort of well structured for a book. It was the character transition from a capitalist to a human rights activist. There was a very good narrative arc. It all fit perfectly into a book, and I wrote it, and it was remarkable how many people liked it and how well it did, and very unusual actually for someone like me to be able to write a book, and it's like lightning striking, and I thought, I got lucky to write a good book, and one and done. But after, and the book ended with the passage of the Magnitsky Act, and afterwards, so much crazy stuff happened that it really felt important to continue to tell the story that Putin had killed more people. He tried to kill other people connected to me. He got involved in trying to manipulate the U.S. political process. He did all sorts of stuff, and it was really important for me to write a second book. So in July of 2018, I sat down to write the second book. And I normally live in London, but I have a house in Aspen, Colorado, which was where I was in July of 2018. And so I set up my computer in my dining room, and I told all my children to stay out of the dining room for the next 4 hours. I turned off the internet on my computer so I wasn't going to get any distractions from emails and all this kind of stuff. I put my phone on silent face down, and I stared at an empty screen. And it was really intimidating because there was no way I thought I could ever write a second book as good as the first book, and I didn't even know how to start. And I started typing, and I deleted, and I typed some more and read it and deleted. And I went through this process for about an hour, and I finally gave up. I couldn't stand not looking at my phone. So I turned it over, and there was 176 new messages that came in the last hour. And the first one read, "Bill, are you watching Helsinki?" with a question mark and an exclamation point. The next one had some expletives, which I won't repeat. The third one said, "If you need a place to hide out, I've got a place in the mountains where you can hide out." And what they were all talking about was that there was this summit that was taking place between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Helsinki. And the summit was the first time that these two presidents had met formally. It was taking place on a Monday. On the previous Friday, Robert Mueller, the special counsel who was investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election, had indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers. And so the obvious question that was going to come up at the summit was what was going to happen with this indictment. So the two presidents, Putin and Trump, go into a meeting, and it was a secret meeting. Nobody else was attending. There was no Secretary of State, no National Security Advisor, no note taker, nobody, or I should say nobody from the American side. It was just Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and one of Putin's guys. And they effectively had a secret summit for 4.5 hours. To this day, nobody knows exactly what took place in that room for 4.5 hours. So after they're done with this secret summit, the two leaders emerge, and they walk up to their respective podiums at the press conference, post-summit press conference. And Putin is looking very self-confident. He's standing tall. He's beaming self-confidence. Trump is kind of looking a little hunched and not good. They go up to their respective lecterns, and they get into the press questioning. And about 3 questions in, the Reuters journalist raises his hand, and he directs his question to Putin. And he said, "Mr. President, are you going to hand over these 12 Russian military intelligence officers?" Putin smiled. He'd been obviously waiting for this question and preparing for it all weekend. And he said, "Yes, it's entirely possible that we would hand over these individuals. But we would expect some goodwill and reciprocity from our American friends. And specifically, we would want them to hand over Bill Browder, me." So that wasn't very pleasant. I mean, of the 7 billion people on the planet, I was the one name that came up in this press conference. It was unpleasant, but it wasn't unexpected. Putin had been chasing me around since the passage of the Magnitsky Act with arrest warrants, with Interpol red notices, with death threats, with kidnapping threats, with all sorts of other nastiness. He had brought me up on many other occasions publicly. And so I almost kind of expected it. But what was unexpected was what happened next. About 3 questions later, another journalist raises his hand, and he directs the question to Donald Trump. And he says, "Mr. President, what do you think of Putin's offer?" And Trump, without missing a beat, said, "I think it's an incredible offer." That was unexpected. To have the most powerful man in the free world offering to hand me over to a dictator who wants to kill me was really, really awful. So the summit ends. The two presidents go in their respective planes at the Helsinki airport, and I'm expecting within any minute that the Trump's advisor, one of his advisors, would gather up the press corps on Air Force One or getting onto the airplane and clarify that what the president meant was that it was an incredibly bad offer or something like that. But there was total silence. So they get on their plane, Air Force One, they fly back to Washington. And the next morning, my wife shakes me awake really early, and she says, "Bill, you've got to see this." And she had been up for about an hour, and she had been downloading the Russian press. And apparently Putin, who's normally considers himself to be this master negotiator, had realized overnight that he made a terrible error in his negotiation. The Americans were asking for 12, and he had only asked for 1. That's really stupid. And so overnight, he added 11 other Americans that he wanted handed over. He wanted the former US ambassador to Russia, Mike McFaul, who was a friend of mine who had helped me with the Magnitsky Act. He wanted a guy named Kyle Parker, who was the chief of staff to the congressional committee that wrote the Magnitsky Act. He wanted 3 acting Department of Homeland Security officers who were investigating money laundering in America connected to the Magnitsky case. Basically, everyone on Putin's list was someone who I knew, who I'd worked with, who had helped me with my campaign for justice for my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Now, it's one thing to ask for a private individual to be handed over, and pretty distasteful. But it's another thing entirely for Putin to ask for a bunch of US, current or former US government officials to be handed over. I mean, who would ever join the government if just by doing your job, making US policy, some future president could hand you over to a murderous dictator that wants to kill you? I mean, that's insanity. And so it would have seemed like within moments when Putin made that announcement, the US would have firmly pushed back on that and said, under no circumstances. But there was more silence. 1 day of silence, 2 days of silence. On the 3rd day, I was giving an interview, and I've been giving interviews all throughout this time. Everyone wanted to know, who's this Bill Browder, and I was going to tell them. On the 3rd day, I was giving an interview with Fox. And I should point out there was no difference between Fox and MSNBC or anybody else. The entire press corps was nothing partisan about it. It was just obviously unreasonable what was going on. And so I'm giving an interview with Fox, and they cut me off halfway into the interview, and they say, we're going to have to hold it right there. There's a press conference taking place in the White House right now. We'll come back to you. So I've got my earpiece in, and I'm listening to this press conference. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she was the president's spokeswoman. And the lady from the New York Times raises her hand, Maggie Haberman, and she says, is the president planning to hand over Bill Browder, Mike McFaul, and the 10 other Americans? And this would have been the moment, the exact moment that they should have pushed back. And she said, well, the president is considering Putin's request and is consulting his advisors. We'll let you know. Everybody, I and everybody else, was in complete shock at this point, because like, what in the world is going on? This is insanity. And again, no partisanship whatsoever, Republicans, Democrats, everyone, this is outrageous, unreasonable. And the Senate decided the next day to have a vote on whether to hand us over or not. And obviously, no senator is going to want to hand us over. And the vote was going to take place at 4 p.m. that day. And as the senators start making public statements about how unreasonable this whole thing is and how they're going to, of course, vote not to hand us over, the White House finally comes to its senses, and at about 3 p.m., an hour before the vote, Trump issues a very meek statement saying, while he understood that Putin's request was very sincere, he would be unable to honor it at this time. An hour later, the Senate votes 98-0 not to hand us over. So when I say I'm delighted to be here tonight, I really am delighted to be here tonight. So how did I end up in this mess? And some of you have heard this part of the story, but for those who haven't, I think it's important to share it. I come from an unusual American family. My grandfather was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas. And he was so good at organizing the union that he ended up getting invited to Russia in 1927. The communists said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Come and check it out. So he goes to Moscow. He meets a Russian girl who becomes my grandmother. My father's born there. And 5 years later, in 1932, they return to America, and he becomes chairman of the Communist Party of the United States of America. So he becomes the head of the American Communist Party. He runs for president in 1936 and 1940 on the communist ticket against Roosevelt. He's imprisoned in 1941, pardoned by Roosevelt in 42, kicked out of the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then viciously persecuted in the 1950s for being a communist. This is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 58 years old. And when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I decided that I needed to find a way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I came up with a perfect way of doing it, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. I became a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated business school in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my life and my career, I had an epiphany, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do. So I had several jobs. I was at the Boston Consulting Group first in their East European practice area. They sent me out to a little town in Poland to advise on a bus factory that was going bankrupt. And I couldn't save the bus factory, but I noticed one day that my interpreter was carrying around a newspaper under his arm. And on the newspaper, there was a bunch of financial figures. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "It's the very first privatization in Poland." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Can you explain it to me?" And so we sat down in his office, and we started going through the numbers. And the first one was the number of shares outstanding of one of the companies that was being privatized. Next number was the price of the shares, and I did the math, and that was $80 million multiplied, the shares outstanding by the price. And then I said, "What's this line?" And he said, "This is net profit, last year's net profit." I said, "No, just read it." I said, "Net profit." That was $160 million. So you don't have to be like some kind of financial genius to know that if you can buy a company for half of 1 year's earnings, that's probably a good deal. I mean, it's different than this whole venture capital thing that you guys do, which where the earnings are out in the future. But so this is half of 1 year's earnings, and I thought, I didn't know anything about investing. I'd never invested a penny before that, but I thought, isn't this what you're like? This is why I went to business school, to do this. And so I had a total savings of $2,000, and I took my savings down to the post office. I converted it to Polish zloty, and I invested in these privatizations, and my $2,000 investment went up 10 times. And that when you have in 1 year, and when you have a 10-bagger, it releases a certain chemical in your stomach, and you want to repeat the experience. And so I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and that was to be an investor in Eastern Europe. I then end up at Salomon Brothers as an investment banker at the very beginning of the Russian privatization program. And at Salomon Brothers, my very first assignment was to advise a fishing fleet located in Murmansk, Russia, which is a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, on their privatization. And so the head of the fishing fleet takes me out to see one of the boats. And it's this enormous vessel. It's like 400 feet long. There's all these nets on the top where they catch the fish, and then the fish get processed throughout this boat. And at the bottom, they actually have canning machines putting them into cans. And so it's not just a fishing boat. It's an ocean-going factory. Very impressive. I asked him, "How much does one of these things cost?" $20 million new. "How many do you have in your fleet?" 100. So 20 million times 100, 2 billion. What's the age of your fleet? 7 years. Now, I don't know anything about fishing or shipping, but I figure that makes it half depreciated. So $1 billion worth of ships. And I had been hired by the management of this fishing fleet to advise them on whether to exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program of Russia to buy 51%. And I asked him, at what price is the government selling 51%? And he said, $2.5 million. Let me just repeat the math. There's $1 billion worth of ships, and you can buy 51% for $2.5 million. So if that chemical had been released in my stomach before, now I was really wanting to repeat the exercise, and this was much better than the situation in Poland. And I was wondering whether this was something just going on in the fishing industry or the shipping or I don't know what. And it turns out that this was going on across the board all over Russia. In order to go from communism to capitalism, they decided to give everything away for free to create a bunch of capitalists. And so I ended up leaving Salomon Brothers, setting up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, moving to Moscow in 1996, and starting to invest. And it went unbelievably well. I started with almost no capital, and again, it wasn't like the funds you have here, where you raise fund 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. This was an open-ended fund where people could put their money in on a monthly basis. And my first month, I think I was up 45%, and so people wanted to put it in and put their money in. Next month is up 36%. And by the time I guess by 18 months in, I was up 865%, and I'd gone from $25 million to $1 billion of assets under management, which was just an enormous. This was back in the days when $1 billion was real money, and it was just an enormous amount of money, and an even more enormous amount of money for Russia, and then what happened was in 1998, the Russian government defaulted on their debt. They devalued their currency by 75%, and I lost $900 million of my $1 billion that I was managing. I went down 90%, which was horrifying because I was the face of the Russian stock market on the way up, and I became the face of the collapse on the way down. And I was even more horrified because I had convinced all these skeptical investors to give me money to manage, and I'd lost them 90% of their money. And so I was determined to try to get their money back. But at that moment in time, I discovered something really terrible, which is that the oligarchs, these people we all now know of, who owned, in most cases, between 51 and 96% of these companies, these oligarchs had behaved themselves up until that moment in time because they wanted access to Wall Street. There are all these fancy bankers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley who are running around Moscow with their Hermes ties, telling all these bankers that they could get money from Wall Street under the one condition that they didn't rip off their minority investors. And before this crash, the oligarchs were like, I don't know if I can do that, but I'd really like free money. And so a lot of them behaved themselves and didn't rip off their minority investors. And so, but after the crash, after everything went down 90% and after the currency was devalued, none of them had any incentive whatsoever to behave themselves. And there's never been any disincentive against misbehavior. And so the oligarchs embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They were doing asset stripping, transfer pricing, embezzlement, dilution, everything on an industrial scale. And so I decided that not as a good investment strategy, but as my only survival strategy. They were going to try to steal the last 10 cents on the dollar that I had. And I needed to stop them. And so I decided to try to stop them from stealing. And there wasn't exactly like I had a lot of tools at my disposal. You couldn't go to the regulator and say these guys are stealing because the regulators were all cut in on the action. You couldn't go to the police, couldn't go to the parliament, couldn't go anywhere really. The only thing that I could do was I could research how they were doing the stealing and then publicize the research. Now you may think to yourself, well, how is it possible to research stealing in Russia? It's a very opaque place. It's a very secretive place. Well, it turns out that it isn't. Russia is actually an incredibly transparent place for a reason that you would never expect. So Russia is the most bureaucratic country in the world. If you go to the bathroom, you got to write your name on the sheet outside the bathroom. And then some guy in some ministry is collecting all that information and entering it on a database. And they're doing it in bathrooms, they're doing it at oil wells, and they're doing it in tax registries, they're doing it everywhere. Everything is the most bureaucratic country in the world, and all the information is being collected by these ministries. And the people in the ministries are paid almost nothing. And so in order for them to survive, they have to sell the information. And so if we were in Russia and I was having a meeting with any of you and I wanted to do a bit of due diligence in advance of the meeting, I could buy your bank statement, find out how much money you have in your account. I could buy your medical records, figure out if you have any embarrassing diseases. I could find out where you've traveled to. I could find out who you've been calling on your mobile phone. I could find out anything. Same thing is true with these companies. And so we were actually able to put together the most unbelievable dossiers of corruption and theft at big Russian companies like Gazprom, Sberbank, Unified Energy Systems. And then I would take this research and I would share it with journalists from the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Business Week. And the journalists loved me because I was saving them all sorts of research and work that they needed to do. And I started publicizing these scandals just at the same time that Vladimir Putin had come to power. Now, Vladimir Putin then was a different guy than he is now. I mean, he might have been the same individual, but he wasn't this tyrannical, self-confident, vicious man. He was this very little man who didn't have power at all. The presidency, all the powers of the president had effectively been usurped by these oligarchs. And so his big job when he first came into office was to try to return some of the powers of the presidency that had been lost. And so he was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. The oligarchs were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. And so when I started to publicize these scandals, Putin would step in. And he would do things like using the state's shares to fire the CEO or to issue a presidential decree to do something or to change the law in some way. And as a result of that, the value, so I went from 25 million to $1 billion down to 100 million. And as Putin was going through this exercise and as I was naming and shaming, I went from 100 million to $4.5 billion. It was up 45 times from the bottom of the market. And obviously, I felt pretty good about myself as a fund manager, and I felt pretty good about Putin actually too, because here was this guy who was like we were on the same side trying to go after the bad guys, and I had the best job in the world, making money and doing good in the same job. But it turned out that Putin's interest was not necessarily to clean up Russia. He just wanted to get rid of the guys he was fighting with, the oligarchs. And so one day at the end of 2003, he decided to win his war with the oligarchs by arresting a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of Yukos, the oil company. He surrounded his private jet in Siberia, arrested him, brought him back to Moscow, put him on trial, and allowed the television cameras to come into the courtroom and film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest guy in Russia and you see a guy far richer, far more powerful, far smarter than you, sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction? You don't want to sit in that cage yourself. And one by one, these guys went to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And he said, real simple, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. And that was the moment that Putin became the richest man in the world. And that was the moment that my interests and his diverged. In November of 2005, So this is about a year and a half after this whole thing. I was flying back to Moscow from a weekend trip to London, and I was arrested at the border. I was detained for 15 hours at the Sheremetyevo Airport Detention Center. I wasn't sure whether I was going to Siberia or being deported. And thankfully, the next morning, they put me on an Aeroflot flight, sent me back to London, and subsequently declared me a threat to national security of Russia. Now, this was a big shock. I was a specialist investing in Russia. I had a $4.5 billion fund. Not being allowed to get into Russia definitely wasn't going to be good for business. But I understood that when the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly. They do so with extreme prejudice. And being kicked out is a pretty mild sanction. So I said to myself, what else can they do? They could arrest my people, or they could seize my assets. And so I organized an emergency evacuation of all of my staff, and I was able to get all of them and all of their family members safely out of Russia. And once everybody was out, we then quickly and quietly liquidated our portfolio in Russia, and we got all of our money out, safe. I breathed a big sigh of relief. I dusted off my hands. I said, maybe I'll write a book about this someday. Time to invest elsewhere. I set up a new investment fund. I thought if I can invest in Russia, I could handle any emerging market after that. I set up this emerging market fund, started investing in other parts of the world. And about 18 months after that, I'm having a board meeting for my new fund in Paris. And I get this frantic call from the one employee I've left in Russia, who is a secretary, who is the lone person manning my empty office in Moscow, who I never spoke to, because I didn't think I kept the office in case the storm ever blew over, but I never thought that there was no reason to speak to her, because there's just nothing going on there. And she's in hysterics, and she said, there's 25 police officers in the office right now drilling the safe and raiding the office. What should I do? And I said, I don't know. Let me call up our lawyer. So I have an American lawyer in Moscow who I used for all my legal stuff. And I call him up. He sounds pretty distracted when I get him on the phone. And I tell him there's 25 police officers in my office. And he says, there's 25 police officers in my office looking for your documents. 50 police officers raiding both of our offices looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies, which at this point were empty. They find them at the law firm's office. They seize those documents. And the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. They have been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police, registered into the name of a man who had been convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early by the police. Now, there was no financial loss for me because we had sold everything the year before. But I'm thinking to myself, if the police are stealing companies and doing identity theft, you're working with murderers, I'm going to be walking through Frankfurt Airport one day and there's going to be some arrest warrant for me. I need to stop this. And so I go out and hire the smartest lawyer I know in Russia, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky, to help me figure this whole thing out, to stop it. I send him out to investigate. He investigates and he comes back and he says, I figured out what's going on and it's not pretty. He said, there's two parts to the scam. The first part was they wanted to steal all of your money, but it failed because you took your money out. He said, however, the second part succeeded. And what he explained was that when we sold everything after I'd been kicked out, we had a profit of $1 billion, and we paid to the Russian government $230 million of capital gains tax. And what Sergei had figured out was that the people who stole our companies went to the tax authorities, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't earn $1 billion. They earned zero. And they came up with a complicated way of explaining this. Therefore, the $230 million of taxes was paid in error, and we'd like that money back. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2007. And it was approved and paid out the next day. So if I had legitimately overpaid $5,000 of taxes in 2006, I'd still be waiting for that refund right now. But they were able to get a $230 million tax refund in one day on Christmas Eve, the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. Now, Sergei and I were convinced that Putin is a nationalist and a patriot. He might be a bad guy, but would he allow his own officials to steal $230 million of their money? This was not my money. This was tax money, that their own tax money. And we were sure that if this was just brought to the attention of the right people, the top people, that the good guys would get the bad guys. And so we wrote criminal complaints to every different branch of Russian law enforcement. I gave interviews to all the TV, radio, newspapers explaining the scam. Sergei gave sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, their version of the FBI. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. And 5 weeks after Sergei testified, the same police officers he testified against came to his home on the 24th of November 2008. They arrested him, they threw him in pretrial detention, and then they began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates in 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers. And they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And they figure, here's a guy who wears a red tie and a blue suit. He goes into a fancy American law firm every morning. He buys his Starbucks coffee. He'll buckle within a week. But they completely misjudged Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei was a man of incredible integrity. For him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more upsetting than the physical pain they were subjecting him to. And he refused. And as a result, the torture and the pressure got worse and worse. And about 6 months into this, his health started to break down. He ended up getting terrible pains in his stomach. He lost 20 kilos. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, they come to him again ask him to sign a false confession. Again, he refuses. In retaliation, they move him from the prison that had a medical facility to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is considered to be one of the most horrific and most awful prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, at Butyrka, they have no medical facilities. And at Butyrka, his health completely breaks down. He goes into a terrible downward spiral, constant agonizing pain. He's desperate for medical attention. He and his lawyers write 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. And every one of those requests was either ignored or denied in writing. On the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. So they put him in an ambulance and sent him across town to a different prison that had a medical wing. But when he arrived there, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. That was November 16th, 2009, 13 years ago. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the very next day, and it was the most horrific, traumatic, heartbreaking, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he worked for me. He was killed as my proxy, and he'd still be alive today if he hadn't been my lawyer. And so when I was finally able to clear the fog of heartbreak and hysteria, to think clearly, I made a vow to his memory, to myself, and to his family that I was going to put aside everything else that I was doing and devote all of my time, all of my energy, and all my resources to go after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And for the last 13 years, that's what I've been doing. Originally, I thought there was some chance of getting justice inside of Russia. Sergei had written everything down. He wrote, during his 358 days in detention, he wrote 450 criminal complaints documenting who did what to him, where they did it, how they did it, when they did it. He would write these up by hand them to his lawyer once a month. The lawyer would file them. They would be ignored or denied, but we got copies. And from those copies, we had the most well-documented case of human rights abuse that's probably ever come out of Russia. And from that, I thought that they'd have to throw at least some of the low-level people under the bus. They'd have to prosecute somebody for this horrific crime. But that didn't happen. They circled the wagons. The Putin regime circled the wagons. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. Putin personally got involved in exonerating every single official involved. And in the most cynical and despicable miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him, in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. They put me on trial as his co-defendant. We were both found guilty. They couldn't do anything more than killing him. To him, they sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. It became obvious well before this crazy trial that we weren't going to get any justice in Russia. So I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And that's when I came up with this idea, which is that these people who killed Sergei did it because they did it to steal $230 million. They don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in the West. And we've all seen it. I mean, there's Russian money is sloshing around everywhere, in Manhattan and South Beach and the French Riviera and the Swiss Alps, and they send their kids to boarding school in England and their girlfriends on shopping trips to Milan and all sorts of other things like that. And so I came up with this idea, which is we may not be able to prosecute them for a torture and murder that took place in Russia. We can't prosecute them in the West for that, but we certainly don't have to allow them to come here and spend their money here. And so I took this idea to Washington, and I presented this story, shared the same story I've just shared with you tonight with two senators, Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, and the late John McCain, Republican from Arizona. And I said, can we ban the visas and freeze the assets of these people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they said yes. And that became the Magnitsky Act. Now, originally, it was just for Sergei Magnitsky. And when they put it onto the law books to be voted on, their phones immediately started lighting up from other victims in Russia who said, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. This is what they do. They commit terrible crimes, kill people, imprison people, do all this type of stuff in Russia. And then they take their money to the West. Can you please sanction the people who killed my father, my husband, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators realized they were onto something much bigger than just one case. They added 65 words to the law to include all gross human rights abusers in Russia. And then all of a sudden, all these other victims came out, fanned out across Capitol Hill, told their stories. And when it went for a vote in the Senate in November of 2012, it passed 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. and it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012, the Magnitsky Act. Vladimir Putin went out of his mind. He was so angry. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families in retaliation. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to try to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He even sent his own emissary to Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, a woman named Natalia Veselnitskaya, to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort. This was after Trump was nominated, but before he was elected, with one specific request: to repeal the Magnitsky Act. Well, I'm very happy that that didn't happen. And it couldn't happen because the Magnitsky Act was an act of Congress, and Trump couldn't just sign an executive order and get rid of it. It would require 51% of Congress, and if they're voting 92-4 a few years before, they weren't going to repeal it. In fact, Congress did something even better, which was they expanded the Magnitsky Act just before Trump was elected. It became the Global Magnitsky Act. Instead of just targeting Russian human rights abusers, it targeted Chinese human rights abusers and Iranian human rights abusers and Venezuelan human rights abusers, from all sorts of bad guys from all over the world. It was really important for me that the Magnitsky Act wasn't just a piece of legislation in the United States, and it was very difficult for me to find other countries that were ready to directly follow the US with this legislation. And so I spent an enormous amount of time working on Canada. And it's interesting because there's lots of countries that are anti-American, but there's no such thing as being anti-Canadian. And it was really a glorious moment in November of 2017, to watch the Canadian Parliament voting on the Magnitsky Act. And I don't know how many of you have watched a Canadian vote before, but each of the members has to stand up briefly to register their vote. It's kind of like a human wave, and so they one by one. It took like 10 minutes. They all each person stood up, and anyone opposed, and the entire Parliament was sitting. It was a unanimous vote of the Canadian Parliament, and passed in 2017. It passed in Britain in 2018. The Magnitsky Act passed in the European Union in 2020. It passed in Australia in 2021. There are now 35 countries with the Magnitsky Acts all around the world, and it's become the tool that's being used. It's the tool that's now being used for all these terrible people in the Putin regime who are involved in this war in Ukraine. And I could have never imagined that one man's death, my lawyer's death, would lead to this huge international justice movement, this law that's being used all over the world, that's being used in this war and being used everywhere. I'll never be able to bring Sergei back, and for me, that's this burden that's going to have to carry with me for the rest of my life. But I have been able to give him a legacy. And I'm not done yet. My hope is that as time goes on and all these countries that have the Magnitsky Act start using it properly and liberally all over the place, that the probability of being sanctioned becomes really high. Right now there's let's say 500 people that are on the Magnitsky list, but my hope is that there'll be 20,000 people on these Magnitsky lists, and if the probability becomes high enough that a dictator who's going to do terrible things will start to think, well, maybe I shouldn't do these terrible things because the risk of not being able to access my money is so high that the crime is not worth the punishment. And my hope is that that's where we get to, and if we do get there, then Sergei Magnitsky's death will save many, many thousands, perhaps millions of lives, and for that, it wasn't a meaningless death. Those are my prepared remarks. I'm here also to talk about current events. because there's a lot to talk about in current events, but I think it's important to tell that story, and I think it's also important to tell that story because I think a lot of the current events are connected to this Magnitsky story. In my second book, it's called Freezing Order, and it's a big part of it is about us tracing who got the $230 million. And what we discovered was that one of the beneficiaries was Vladimir Putin. He didn't get it in his own name. Some of you may remember the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers was a leak from a law firm in Panama called Mossack Fonseca. Apparently, I think some secretary who was going out with the managing director was mistreated by him, and she decided to leak the entire database of the entire law firm. And every country had a hero or an anti-hero. And the anti-hero of Russia was a man named Sergei Roldugin. And Sergei Roldugin had a very interesting backstory, which is he was a cellist from St. Petersburg. And the Panama Papers had these unbelievable details of how this cellist from St. Petersburg ended up getting $2 billion from oligarchs and Russian state banks. And I mean, the next richest cellist in the world is Yo-Yo Ma with 25 million, and this is a Russian cellist that no one's ever heard of, has got 2 billion. And everyone said, why did this cellist get all this money? And the answer is because he's Putin's best friend from childhood. He's the godfather of Putin's daughter, and one of his daughters, and he introduced Putin to his wife, and he's Putin's proxy, he's Putin's nominee. This is how Putin stores his money. And the most interesting thing we discovered for ourselves was that in our money laundering investigation, which I've conducted for 12 years, we discovered that Sergei Roldugin got some of the money from the Magnitsky case. And so Putin got some of the money, which explains a lot about why he was so eager to cover this crime up. And as we continued our money laundering investigation, we discovered that one of the main banks that laundered the money was a Danish bank called Danske Bank. And they laundered 200 million of the 230 million through their Estonian branch. And we were able to verify this from data that we had gotten from whistleblowers and other data leaks. And once we figured this out, we were contacted by a Danish investigative journalist team who had gotten another big data leak of all sorts of account information, but they couldn't make any sense of it because we had determined from our data the names of the accounts and the account holders and all this kind of stuff in this Danske Bank. They wanted to see our data. And so we gave them our data. They compared it with their data leak, which was called the Russian laundromat. And they called us back and they said, it's actually not 200 million that was laundered through this Danish bank. It was 8.3 billion. And so they published the article in their newspaper, and it was the most well-read article in the history of their newspaper. And Denmark is a country which is supposed to be really squeaky clean. It's the number 2 country on the Transparency International Index. And the CEO of the bank couldn't just shrug it off and not do anything about it. And so he ordered a special external audit of the whole thing. And he was maybe hoping that the auditors, the law firm and the accounting firm and the data analysis, they'd come back and say, actually, the journalists weren't right. But they came back with their external audit, and they came back and discovered that it wasn't 8.3 billion, it was 234 billion that had been laundered from Russia. Now, this is just one bank that we could lift the hood on, one Danish bank. If we could lift the hood on Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna, on UBS and Credit Suisse in Switzerland, on Deutsche Bank in Germany, I think we would get a number closer to $1 trillion of money that was stolen by Putin and the 1,000 people around him from Russia. $1,000 billion. And I think this explains everything. So you can steal a smaller amount of money over a shorter period of time and probably get away with it. But to steal $1 trillion, this is money that should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and public services, and instead it was spent on jets and yachts and so on and so forth. You can do this for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, but you just can't do this for 22 years without the people eventually rising up. And Putin understands very clearly that if at some point the Russian people were to rise up and want to get rid of him, there's no, he can't do like George Bush and set up the Putin Presidential Library and paint, or like Boris Johnson, sit on the back bench and give speeches for $250,000 a pop. If Putin were to lose power, he'd lose his money, he'd go to jail, and he'd die. And so for Putin, he's got to stay in power forever. He understands that. It's a question of life and death. And for Putin to stay in power forever is a very hard thing if he's just continuing to tighten and tighten and tighten the screws and take away and create this pressure cooker environment. And particularly in this moment in time, if we look at it, after COVID, you have all of these leaders that are losing their jobs. Mario Draghi lost his job. Bolsonaro is going to lose his job. Boris Johnson lost his job. The guy from Israel lost his job. All Democratic leaders are losing their jobs. And so if there's anything, it was going to happen to him. And so what does a dictator do when they're afraid they're going to lose their job, that the people are going to rise up against them? Machiavelli 101. Read The Prince, Machiavelli the Prince. You create a foreign enemy, you go to war. This war is not about NATO enlargement. This war is not about Putin's legacy. There's a lot of people saying that he wants to create a great Russian empire for his legacy. If he cared about his legacy, he wouldn't have stolen $1 trillion from his people. That's just not what a person does who wants legacy. This war is about a small-minded criminal who's stolen a lot of money, who's desperate to stay in power. And that is a very important conclusion, because if that's the case, then these proposals are like from Elon Musk says, well, let's just give them let's just give the Russians 4 territories and declare Ukraine neutral. And to avoid war. None of that avoids any war at all. Because Putin, he doesn't care about that stuff. He just wants to be at war. And so there's only one of 2 outcomes that can come from this whole thing. Either the Russians win or the Ukrainians win. And if the Russians win in Ukraine, then I guarantee you they're going to be at the Estonian border next. And if they're at the Estonian border next, they'll point their guns at Estonia, which is a NATO member, and probably point a few nukes at us, and then watch us go crazy on our talk shows about, wait a second, why do we have this Article 5 of NATO where we have to go to war with Russia? The Americans, the British, and the Russians and the Ukrainians signed a treaty called the Budapest Memorandum, where they basically said if they give up their nuclear weapons, that we would guarantee their integrity, their territorial integrity. The Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons, and what happens? We also, well, actually, it wasn't a treaty, it was just a memorandum, so never mind. I guarantee you that we would have that same conversation about NATO, and that's what Putin would be hoping for. And if we have that conversation and then we give up NATO, then all hell is going to break loose in the world. And so we cannot allow the Ukrainians to lose this war. And at the moment, we've given the Ukrainians enough so they're not losing the war, but we're not giving them enough to win the war. And there's a lot of people in the US government and other governments that are kind of wanting to hold back on giving the Ukrainians what they actually need militarily to win this war. And there's a lot of people that are saying, we don't want, that he's threatening nuclear war. If we're going to cave into his threats of nuclear war right now over Ukraine, then why not just cave over every place? Because, if he's going to do it for Ukraine, why doesn't he do it for Germany or anywhere else? And so this is really an existential, we're at a moment of existential crisis, and the Ukrainians at the moment are doing a good job, but I hate to say this, and people always criticize me for being a bummer speaker, but I'm not sure how I can see this thing ending. I don't see that there is no. It's hard for me to see that the Russians can win this war because the Ukrainians have enough to stop them, but I don't think the Ukrainians have enough to win the war either. And so I can imagine this thing carrying on. And will Putin, do a nuclear attack? He could. He's a psychopath. I think we're a long way away from that. He's got a lot of other things up his sleeve to cause trouble. I mean, who would have thought that he would decide to just bomb every power plant in Ukraine right now before the winter? That's pretty clever. Make them freeze to death in the winter. That's not a bad, sort of out of, control military strategy. Could he blow up our internet cables? Sure. Pipelines, absolutely. And all sorts of other stuff that we can't even imagine because no one's ever done it before. That's how Putin is probably going to behave in the coming years and months and so on. Anyways, let me as now that I've really bummed you out, let me answer any questions because I'm sure you have a lot of questions and I can.
So we're going to have some runners. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mics up to you. One over there.
Sorry. So thank you for a really, really good talk. I have a question about something I didn't see in the freezing order. So you constantly face this really terrible odds. You're literally taking on a country. In doing so at a very considerable personal risk, right? What about everyone else, right? Like your family, your wife, your kids. There's adverse effects throughout everyone. What about the conversation that somebody had with you saying, is it worth it? How did you respond to that conversation?
Well, it's a really impossible position to be put in when somebody is murdered. And for me, I have no capacity to allow that to. I mean, if I had not done what I did, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. It would have poisoned me from the inside. I couldn't, being the person I am, I couldn't have done that. And thankfully, I'm married to a woman who is equally outraged by the whole thing. And I wouldn't want my kids to be brought up by a father who did anything different than what I'm doing, because it's important for them to see what integrity and what justice is, and so yes, it's been incredibly costly. Not as costly for me as it has been for other people connected to me. There's a man in my book named Vladimir Karamurza, who helped me get the Magnitsky Act passed in various countries, including here in Canada. And he was a Russian dissident, Russian opposition politician. And in retaliation for his good work for me, they poisoned him with Novichok in 2015, and he nearly died. And they poisoned him in 2017. Again, he nearly died. He survived both attempts. And he went back to Moscow after the war started to stand up against Putin. And I had dinner with him 3 nights before he returned to Moscow, and I said, don't go. They'll put you in prison. And he said, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but I can't not go because how am I asking the Russian people to stand up to Putin if I'm not willing to do it? And he went back and he was arrested after he gave an interview on CNN calling Putin a murderer. And he's now facing 24 years in prison for high treason. And so, I mean, people pay the highest price for this. But we all choose our course in life. And what's interesting about it is the Russian people, for the most part, aren't like Vladimir Karamurza. We were just talking about this at our dinner table this evening. Most people in Russia have an extremely narrow focus. They just want to focus on their own lives. If you have, in fact, it's really interesting. In an apartment building in Moscow, you can have the most beautiful apartment, the highest level, everything, best marble, best wood, best everything, and then you walk out into the common areas and it smells like urine because there's just no sense of common good. People don't care about anybody other than themselves, and as a result of that, you end up in a situation where Russians just could not care less about what Putin is doing. They couldn't care less for a very long time until the moment that they're all being called up for draft, and then they're all flapping about like the world's coming to an end, which it is for them. But why didn't they start flapping about, 20 years ago? Everyone chooses their own path. I wish that there were a few more people like Vladimir Kara-Murza in Russia.
And we have time for one more question.
Only one? I have time for more if you want.
I've got the mic. Bill, I had the pleasure of seeing you the last Relay AGM, and your story is, of course, incredible and captivating, and I think we're all at the edge of our seat listening to what you had to say. So I kind of had a two-part question, and I think I asked the same question back then, which is, I, by the way, saw the live Donald Trump and Putin when they said, and your name came up, and I said, hey, I met that guy, right? With apart from now, but also in the news, there's been a lot of mysterious oligarchs and oil executives that have been falling out of windows in hospitals and stuff like that. So my first question is, I think I asked the same question, is how are you still alive? And two, do you think that we're starting to see the effects of all this embezzlement and stealing and everything else kind of play out in this war? Because you'd think that all of us before thought the Red Army was this terrible thing that we're going to go in and steamroll and just take over Ukraine in 30 seconds, but instead they're facing opposition and they don't have the military might that we thought they had. And instead, perhaps all this money that should have gone to not only infrastructure, hospitals and hotels, but also tanks and regiments and ballistics have gone into oligarchs' pocket. And like you said, I've been to London 1,000 times, and it's little Moscow there, and there's Russian money being thrown all over the place. But do you think the Russian people aren't starting to see this now and going, oh, wait a minute, we've been bamboozled for years, and we're not who we thought we were?
Well, I mean, it's from so the reason I'm alive is the same reason that the Ukrainians are doing such a remarkable job. For me, it's a matter of survival, as it is for the Ukrainians, and for the Russians, the whole system has been hollowed out in every different way. I mean, it's the Russians have not created air superiority over Ukraine. Why? A pretty big part of it is because they don't have an airworthy Air Force. Why don't they have an airworthy Air Force? Because they got a bunch of MiGs, and they've sold all the parts off their MiGs to the Indian Air Force, who have an airworthy Air Force. And I heard an amazing story from a filmmaker I know who was on the front line, American filmmaker who was on the front line in Ukraine as the war was just starting. And they had a program at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians, they were offering Russian tank drivers $25,000 for their $2 million tanks. They said, let's not shoot at each other. We'll just pay you $25,000. And he witnessed the purchase of $2 million tanks for $25,000 each. And they said, bring your friends. We'll buy their tanks too. And that's been the story of the entire system. And we were just talking at dinner tonight about the nuclear arsenal. And, and I don't want to extrapolate this too much, but how do we even know that their nuclear arsenal works? Wouldn't the guys in the nuclear force be, not doing their job and not, maybe these things will blow up in their silos. I don't want to go so far as to not say we shouldn't be worried about that, but I think that that's a very real possibility based on their performance. And it's a hollowed out system. I don't think Russia's even in the top 10 military powers. We thought it was number 2 before this war started.
I lied. We actually have some extra questions. Go here to Kenny.
Bill, great to see you alive. I'm glad you didn't get assassinated on that hill in Napa. My question is, what do you think China has learned from this, especially as it comes to Taiwan? To our response.
So imagine. So let's put the context in place here. America spends $1 trillion or more, maybe two. I don't remember the exact numbers on Afghanistan, and then a year and a half ago, America decides, for the sake of 3,000 soldiers who aren't even in combat, to let the country fall to the Taliban. 38 million people fall to the Taliban because we have so little appetite for military confrontation. So you're sitting there, you're Xi Jinping and you're Vladimir Putin, you're saying, the only other signal we've ever gotten as strong as this was that red line in Syria where we didn't enforce it. Hell, the Americans will never show up for anything. So Putin goes in first to Ukraine thinking he's going to steamroll them and we're not going to do anything. And boy, is he wrong about the steamrolling, and boy, is he wrong about us not doing anything. And we've been, and the sanctions are just bigger, more far-reaching, and more aggressive than anything that's ever happened before. And so imagine you're Xi Jinping, and you've been eyeing up this morsel of Taiwan for a long time, and it's really annoyed you that they're so, snubbing their nose at, and you see this huge economic crisis that we've inflicted on the Russians. I think that they still want Taiwan, but they're not going to, if they were planning to invade, that's been put off indefinitely while they try to figure this thing out. And so I think that this is not just for these two guys, but for every dictator out there who thinks these symbols this is hugely important, not just for the Ukrainians, but for every country that has, where people are eyeing up their borders. And so I think this is really important for China. And on a commercial basis, everybody thought, okay, the Chinese companies are going to come in and take the place of the American companies. And MasterCard and Visa pulls out. Alipay is going to show up. But Alipay doesn't want to get on some sanctions list, for the rest of the world, for some little country like Russia. And so the Chinese have not showed up to replace the Americans that have pulled out on a commercial basis. And so I think this is really a true watershed moment for the good guys in giving a really big black eye to a bad guy and sending the message that this could happen elsewhere as well.
So, Bill, just to follow up on Kenny's question, just coming in from the Russian angle, so what is that exit ramp for Putin right now?
There's a great little image on Twitter, which was the Kersh Bridge, and that's the exit ramp. He can go back. We don't have to give Putin an exit ramp. Putin is a thug. He only understands power and hard boundaries. He can come up with his own exit ramp. It's not for us to give him a dignified way out. In fact, it sends a terrible signal if we give him a dignified way out. What it sends a signal is that he still has some hold over us. We should just give the Ukrainians everything they need to not just to not lose, but to win the war. That means longer range artillery. That means stopping buying Russian oil and gas, and that means hard secondary sanctions on countries that are involved in evading sanctions, and let the course of this war take its natural course. I don't think we should give them an exit ramp or save face, and it really annoys me when I hear Macron and others saying that, because what does he deserve an exit ramp for?
Bill, on behalf of everyone here, I just wanted to thank you for coming to speak with us today. It was truly amazing and one we'll never forget. So thank you.
Thank you.